rules were. And at this time, 25 students in the room. A lot of students will fall through the cracks. You know, the management was just a little rough. So we said, okay, we have some very charismatic students in here, some very talented students. We're creating teams. We had this idea of a team competition midway through our project anyway. Let's go ahead and do the teams now. So one day it was like a basketball match. We just lined up the students. You're a team leader, you're a team leader, you're a team leader. Hire your team. You can hire 4 people. And they knew each other, they hired their teams. Right? Some better than others. Right? You saw the very shrew, like the future company owners. That one over here, this very unpopular person is really smart over here. I was like, oh, okay. So they built their own teams. So we had these weekly team leader meetings where at first I was running around from computer to computer to computer, like, oh, fix this. And my co-instructor, a teaching fellow from CPS, funded by the MacArthur Foundation and the National Summer Learning Association, they wanted to map what we did to the Common Core, which is an interesting idea. I'm not sure that's really useful. But anyway, I support it 100%. He was saying, Damon, you're sweating, and the students aren't sweating. This is like the second week. You're sweating, and the students are not sweating. They need to sweat, right? I'm like, wow, okay, this is an interesting concept. So what happens? We set up a rule sheet. And we had this quote called "Teamwork makes the dream work," right? So we had this big piece of paper taped to the wall that says how we work together. If you have a question, ask your peers, and if you still have a question, ask more peers, right? Only if nobody in the class knows the answer can you ask an instructor. So for 2 full weeks, actually about 3 weeks, I'm over here like, Mr. Drummond, I'm just pointing to the board. Right? Because how do you replicate this idea? As far as I know, whenever I'm learning like code and stuff, when I was learning Ruby on Rails, you have to like go to the web and you ask your peers, right? You email somebody, you go to some kind of forum, right? You're asking your fellow developers, right? So how do we replicate that with students who are used to sitting in a room and somebody is like feeding them knowledge and information? Does that make sense? So how do we like break that habit of learning, right? So we said, okay, we have these teams. So you ask your team first. If you can't find the answer, you come out of your team and find somebody who has the answer. And only if no team knows the answer can you ask the instructor, right? So that was one of the ways that we learned together. So what happened is, it was, I think, mid-June. So this is like literally the second week of our project. I've been really wanting, and Juan Pablo knows this, I really was deliberating on whether or not we were going to use GitHub. Now GitHub, to use Git, you have to have like administrative privileges on a computer, you got to install some stuff. KKC was not having that. I was like halfway through the first sentence of my request, they just looked at me. I said, never mind. I'm not going to have a lab confirmed yet, right? Like, so let's just, I didn't say anything, right? But come to find out, as of June, I think 15th or 18th, or I'm sorry, July 15th or 18th, the entire Git flow could be done in the browser. So there was no need to install anything natively on the computer. So the students could create a repository, right? Create their README document, right? Create their HTML file, right? Create their CSS file, push it to GH pages, right? Make that the default, right? Now they can make now they can make branches and do pull requests and merge, and even collaborate on that with their sites. And what's happening when it gets pushed to the GH pages branch, the website's online now, which solves the problem of these sites being just like on a local browser, right? Or just on a local computer, and nobody can see them. Now their site's on the web. Now there's more pressure, right? It's like, wow, this is real. I'm really online, right? Everybody familiar with GitHub? Yeah, so it's really cool. Then you have gists, and you have like Markdown, you can do all kinds of cool little lesson plans. I would do entire lessons plans on a gist document. They're just like scrolling down. I'm going to show you one. We were teaching the CSS box model. It was called knock them out the box, right? So we did Bootstrap. So I showed them GitHub. So they were using GitHub just to do some basic HTML and CSS. And then the week of the team competition, so we wanted to encourage the students not just to learn, but to show how this tech stuff can like empower them to get back to their neighborhood. So we decided to create a website for the Englewood Arts Festival. And the idea was that the 5 teams would compete to build the best site possible for the Englewood Arts Festival, which happened this past weekend. So that week they released Bootstrap. So they received a briefing from the organizer of the Englewood Arts Festival And then for the next hour, they were briefed on Bootstrap. So having learned GitHub for like a day, right, the previous Thursday, right, the next Monday they were introduced to this idea called Bootstrap. You're on Twitter, but people at Twitter create this thing called Bootstrap, which has a whole library of CSS that you can use and rapidly develop a website that looks really clean and professional. And they were having a ball with you, right? So they spent a whole week using learning Twitter Bootstrap, learning how to use it, but also building a site for a client. And so a week later, they all had completed sites. I think we'll find some, we'll show some, maybe not. So that was that. So this past week, actually late last week, we started with the Raspberry Pi. We wanted to do the Raspberry Pi earlier, but again, I had to pause and learn to appreciate the process, right? Say, okay, we're doing this like HTML, CSS, and a little bit of JavaScript stuff. We're still figuring out GitHub, and Bootstrap is like this extra added layer of simplicity on the one end, but complexity on the other. So let's just like stay there and let it percolate and marinate, right? And so now we're opening up the Pi, and it's pretty exciting. So it's like a whole new wow factor now. I mean, if it got old, it became very new this past Thursday and Friday. So what the next slide?